I'm not going to anticipate any comment or opinion on my end, because I want Lucy to really take the floor. The only thing I want to say is something that I've said already when the proposal was adopted and published 2 days ago, which is, whatever you think of it, this is going to change many things. Meaning, there is a before, when many governments, many private sector representatives were working on frameworks, principles, and so on. And there is an after this proposal, when one institution, the European Commission, has taken a position on creating a governance framework and proposing a governance framework for artificial intelligence in a way that is not just a declaration of principles, but it's a full-fledged regulatory proposal. So I'm sure that this is going to also steer the direction of the debate from now on, not only in Europe, but certainly a lot in Europe, but not only in Europe, but also outside Europe. And this is why today, what will be presented by Lucy will then be commented upon by academics, academics that also have a business hat, if you wish, a corporate hat, but also those that will need to work on the proposal from now on, a member of the European Parliament, but also an expert that connects from the United States that has been extremely, let's say, interested and attentive in looking at what the EU was doing in this field. So I will present them then bit by bit as we move on. What I want to do now, as we have already 336 people in the room, is to give the floor to Lucy Sioli. And Lucy is a director for artificial intelligence and digital industry in the G-Connect, Director A. She is the person that materially not only has orchestrated and accompanied before the work of the high-level expert group, the work of the Commission on AI, but also the work that has led to the finalization and presentation of this proposal. So, Lucy, we have been fighting many battles. We have been having many meetings till late hours over the past years. And we are extremely excited that this has happened. I don't know if you're relieved or now your communication work starts, so maybe you cannot take a break that much. But we are extremely happy and proud that you have accepted our invitation today. So I give you the floor. I will share my screen so that you, whenever you want me to change the slides, you just tell me next, and I will give you the floor for your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Andrea, and thanks a lot to CEPS for inviting me to make this presentation on this regulatory framework. As Andrea said, it was published only a couple of days ago, so it's very fresh, and this is probably one of the first presentations I ever make about this regulatory framework. I hope I am actually able to explain it because it's complex. It's complex, it's the outcome of a number of years of work. And although Andrea has kindly indicated me as being accompanying all this work, I was, of course, surrounded by an excellent team and a lot of other people, including the high-level expert group, upon whose work this is really developed. So let me start with the next slide, which simply says a very simple thing. We're going to be talking about the regulatory framework in the next few months and probably years. And this is going to make artificial intelligence look very bad because everybody thinks that we regulate because, of course, this is a harmful kind of technology. So for me, the most important thing to start by saying is that artificial intelligence is actually very good for our economies, for our societies. We've seen the impact it has made during COVID. It's very versatile. It can be applied to many different things. And however, it does raise some concerns, in particular in terms of fundamental rights and in terms of safety. And it is because we want to be able to make sure that the use of artificial intelligence does not violate the rights and the high standards of safety that we have acquired in our lives in the European Union. This is why we think we need to come forward with some rules for artificial intelligence. Next slide. And next slide. So basically, our starting point was simply to note that there are characteristics of AI like opacity, like being probabilistic, like being autonomous, that were giving rise to some issue. And as I said, in particular, in terms of safety and fundamental rights. And this has created a certain mistrust. Today, if you look at the statistics, there are not many companies using AI in the European Union, and about 65% of them would say that this is because they don't trust artificial intelligence. So the way we have to look at the rules on AI is an instrument to enhance trust and having more businesses and organizations use artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence, as I said, is good for our societies. Next slide. We immediately faced a difficult problem when we started regulating on or writing this piece of legislation. The fact that it's probably the first time somebody pretends to write a regulation about a technology, and actually this is not a regulation about a technology, it's a regulation about the way this technology is used or applied in certain specific applications. But one complexity is the fact that AI is a set of techniques, and that these techniques evolve. So the way AI is developed today is probably not the same in which it will be developed in a few years' time. So we had to come up with a definition of AI that was kind of future-proof. Like the whole legislative piece had to be a little bit future-proof. And so one decision we made was to opt for a definition which is a bit general, like like the one you have on the screen, which is actually the OECD definition. And using this definition allows us also to indicate a list of techniques in Annex. And our legislative technique exactly is to be able to update these annexes, which are more technical, over time, maybe through delegated acts, so that we can take into account the changes that take place in the technology. Next slide. We come up with a pyramid of risk. You know that, maybe the second complexity we had to face was the fact that we didn't want to regulate the whole artificial intelligence market, because we don't think we need that. We think we really wanted to only focus on what we consider to be high risk applications of artificial intelligence. So those applications that have a high risk of violating fundamental rights or safety. And because of that, we had to come up with a definition of what is high risk. This is what you will find in the annex to our regulation. And we identified through also the evidence that we had some specific use cases of high risk. Now, when we look at this pyramid summarizes all the different levels of risk that we have addressed. Most of the artificial intelligence market is made of AI that is not risky. Then there is maybe a very small top of what is actually unacceptable risk, and I'll talk about it. And then there is a group in the middle of high risk. And this group can include both artificial intelligence embedded in products like medical devices, or artificial intelligence, we call it standalone. So artificial intelligence that is in software, it can be recruitment applications, it can be applications dedicated to education or to determine the creditworthiness of a person. And then we are going to have another group of AI applications to which we only apply transparency obligations. And this is to allow people, for example, to be aware of the fact that they are interacting with artificial intelligence. Next. This is what I've just mentioned now. It's a fact that one important part of the legislation will impose transparency obligations on some AI systems that need to make people aware that they're interacting with AI. And so this can happen with a chatbot, but it can also happen with deepfakes, not so much to make people aware they're interacting in AI here, but mostly to make sure that if this is not obvious, that people are not decepted by the deepfakes. And I think another important element is that these systems, if they use emotional recognition systems, they should flag it to people, because this is something that emotional recognition is something that can actually be very good in certain applications, but less tolerated in certain other cases. Next slide. Let me now focus on the most important part, which is the past or the high-risk applications. And here, as I said earlier, in a way we have two groups, and this is how the easiest way to maybe imagine this regulation is that one group is made of artificial intelligence. There is a component of products, and many of these products that are already regulated in the European Union because of safety. And think, for example, of medical devices, or think of toys, or think of robots, for example. And then there are other categories of artificial intelligence where it is not embedded in products, and which, in our opinion, represent use cases that can be high risk from the point of view of the violation of fundamental rights or safety. And when I talk about fundamental rights, I talk about the whole group of fundamental rights, but the one that normally stands out the most is obviously non-discrimination. And what you can see in the slide, I've just briefly listed the areas that are subject to the list of use cases. If you're interested more, you have to go to Annex 3 of the legislation, and this will include biometric identification. It will include critical infrastructure, education, employment use cases, access to private services like financial services, and also certain public services, law enforcement, migration, asylum and border control, and administration of justice and democratic processes. So in essence, this is the groups or the areas in which the high risk use cases fall into. Next slide. What do we do with these use cases? Basically, what we are putting in place is a CE marking process. CE marking is a process that is applied in our product safety legislation. And basically what it does is simply says before a product is put on the European market, it has to get a CE marking. To do that, it means that it has to comply with a certain number of rules and obligations. And once it is CE marked, it can be put on the European market and it can circulate freely across the European Union market. So we use this approach because it's used in safety product legislation. It's pretty successful, and it can apply also to AI. Also when AI is a software, because in fact, what we notice also in the legislation is that increasingly, for example, in medical devices regulation, software is considered like a product. So we consider a little bit the functional equivalence of AI, whether it's in a product or whether it's in a software, and we apply the CE marking system to all of them. Next slide. What obligations do these artificial intelligence systems have to comply with in their CE marking, meaning that before they are being put on the market, they are going to be checked in terms of their compliance to a certain list of obligations. And this list is what we have on the screen now. We're going to be checking that the artificial intelligence system is using high quality data sets, that there is documentation that has been established in relation to the way the system has been designed and the parameters that has been fed with. It will have to provide a certain level of information to the user. That information will also critically include information about the human oversight system that has to be put in place, in particular by the users. And then also give information about the tests that have been carried out to make sure that the system is robust, accurate, and resilient as much as possible to cybersecurity. Now, these are 5 requirements, which are very much based on the work of the high-level expert group. They came up with key requirements, and they were probably 6 or 7. We have merged probably a couple of them into one. So this is the list, and so this list is also the outcome of the piloting that we have made through the work of the high-level expert group. Next slide. In essence, these obligations imply both the provider and the user of artificial intelligence systems. The provider has to make sure exactly when it undertakes an assessment in front of a conformity, as part, sorry, of a conformity assessment, and before putting the good or the software on the market, it has to establish a quality management system in its organizations. It has to draw up the technical documentation. It has to comply with login obligations so that the operation of the AI system can be monitored when in use. Undertake the conformity assessment before the artificial intelligence system is put on the market, and get the CE labeling market, help in monitoring ex post the artificial intelligence systems, and collaborate with the market surveillance authorities, because a system of conformity assessments where a provider of a product or a software goes and makes certain checks about the quality and the transparency of the system is fine in terms of minimizing the risk that can emerge with artificial intelligence, but it doesn't eliminate those risks completely. So there is a need to continue monitoring the system when it's in use, and also to make sure that when it's in use, there is a system of market surveillance authorities who are able to intervene in case of harm. And these market surveillance authorities may go and check the documentation that has been presented at the time of the conformity assessment to see if there is any problem there, or simply check whether maybe it's a fault on the side of the user or it's nobody's fault, and then act by consequence by either asking to withdraw the system from the market or imposing sanctions as needed. So the other set of obligations is actually on the user, but these are much lighter than on the provider. And the user basically has to follow the instructions of use. Very importantly, the user has to put in place the human oversight system, because it's only the user, of course, who can ensure that, monitor possible risks, and so on. Existing legislation like GDPR continues to apply. Next slide. So if we look at this from the point of view of a life cycle, we have an operator or a developer who has to design the artificial intelligence systems in line with the requirements I explained earlier, bring this to a conformity assessment. This is done by notified bodies in the European Union, or make a self-assessment when a notified body doesn't exist, continues to monitor the performance of the system once in the market, also because the system may continue to learn. And in this case, if continuous learning or the retraining through a new set of data, for example, of that same system gives rise to big changes in terms of the behavior and the performance characteristics of that system, then that system will have to be assessed again, and will have to undertake a new conformity assessment. Next slide. That was about what we would do for the high-risk systems, which I said are those AI systems embedded in products which are already subject to our safety legislation, and the list of use cases that you will find in Annex 3 of the regulation. But then we also prohibit some practices. And we prohibit, these are only 4 practices, they're very limited, but we think they're important. We prohibit the subliminal manipulation, which may result in physical or in psychological harm, or the use of AI to exploit children or mentally disabled people. We forbid and prohibit the general purpose social scoring, because we think this is not for the European Union. And we also prohibit real-time remote biometric identification systems, with a number of exceptions. I will come back to that later. Next. Indeed, I come back to it now. Remote biometric identification systems is a chapter on its own, and you may have seen it's the one that is most debated in the media nowadays. Basically, remote biometric identification, in particular, we are concerned when this biometric identification takes place in public spaces, is already addressed by GDPR, and it is already prohibited for the private, but also for the law enforcement authorities when in certain circumstances. What we do here is to actually prohibit the use of artificial intelligence in the context of the real-time remote biometric identification systems in public squares. So we are not forbidding the fact that there are cameras, or that municipalities put up cameras. That doesn't have anything to do with AI. What we are prohibiting is when artificial intelligence is used through these systems to identify people that may belong to a watch list. Now, when this happens in real time, this can be very intrusive from the point of view of fundamental rights, because here is the case when a law enforcement authority will immediately stop a person and will immediately limit the freedom of a person. And we think that this can only happen in very specific cases, in particular when the law enforcement authorities are looking for a very serious crime and when they have a judicial authorization to do that. Also, the member states need to have a national law that allows the implementation of these exceptions. So in essence, the use of real-time biometric identification is prohibited, except for these very specific circumstances, but they need to have a national legal base to be put in place. And when it comes to ex post remote biometric identification system, we think that this should be allowed. And together with the allowed cases of real-time systems, all this has to undertake ex-ante third-party conformity assessment, because remote biometric identification systems are well known for making mistakes. So one day, hopefully, the technology will be improved, but at the moment they make significant mistakes. And so this can be particularly problematic in their implementation. Next slide. This regulation has to, tries also to make sure that we support the development of artificial intelligence. So we have introduced, for example, regulatory sandboxes, and we have introduced also the possibility of using data that have been lawfully collected including on personal data, to be used to retrain artificial intelligence systems with very specific public interest, like applications for the green economy or for healthcare, under the supervision of the Data Protection Authority in very controlled environment. This is an important novelty that I hope that will be picked up and discussed as well. And then we have some support for SMEs and startups. In particular, in parallel with the regulation, we have published a coordinated plan. We'll be setting up testing experimentation facilities that will offer free services to the small, medium enterprises and the startups, as well as equity funding, as well as the digital innovation hubs that will help the SMEs to uptake AI and understand it a little bit better. Next slide. And now, basically, to conclude, the governance structure that all this needs is based on two levels. There is a national level where the competent authorities of the member states will be organized. Now, these competent authorities are at different levels. I mean, the member states should be able to choose the notified bodies, which do the ex-ante conformity assessment, but also the market surveillance authorities. In the product safety legislation, the market surveillance authorities tend to be regulators of certain areas. They're normally divided by sectors. And for example, for creditworthiness, maybe the member states will decide that the financial regulator is the right market surveillance authority. For biometric identification, data protection authority could be the right authority, and so on. this is a competence of the member states to choose. And then at the European level, we would like to organize an artificial intelligence board chaired by the Commission, but made by representatives of the member states, probably the market surveillance supervisors, as well as the the data protection authority supervisor could be a member of this board. They would be advised and helped by an expert group. We need, again, an expert group different from the high-level expert group we had before, because we don't need, we already made extensive use, I think, of the very important guidelines and the work they produced. And now I think we will need a group that will help us monitor in the market and see if other new use cases are coming up. They could be part of our list of use cases that we could update regularly, and they could also advise or make recommendations to the Artificial Intelligence Board in terms of next steps and adjustments to be made. And then I think that the next slide is probably my last slide, simply because I would like to say here that the AI package we published is not only the regulatory framework I've just presented now, it's also a coordinated plan written with member states. It's an update of something we did with them in 2018, and now we publish a review. And this review is due because markets have changed, because now we have the Recovery and Resilience Fund, because after the pandemic, everything is different. Healthcare is much more important. Green Deal is much more important. We need an infrastructure also for artificial intelligence. I'm talking about cloud, I'm talking about the computing infrastructure. And so the coordinated plan addresses all that, including specific measures to support research, development, innovation, and uptake, and skills as well in AI. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. Very, very comprehensive description of, indeed, quite a read. 108 pages with all the supporting documents, the studies that back them. But I'm sure that many of the 402 participants here in this webinar have spent quite some late hours trying to get ready for this event, or in any case to catch up with what the Commission has proposed. I think there are some things that very few people would have expected, or people maybe did not fully expect in this proposal. I don't want to preempt what will be said by the different commentators, but I was throughout the process, I think I noted the introduction of the top of the pyramid. And you know, probably Barry and Francesca remember very well that the high-level expert group got a little bit in trouble when we moved from our early mention of the red lines into a subsequent mention of areas of critical concern, which were found to be a little bit too soft on our end. And I think the Commission has been quite bold there. The sandboxes part is quite interesting. The Council of the EU has called on the Commission already in last November to speed up on regulatory sandboxes. And I think this proposal is perhaps, after a few provisions in the fintech area, the first proposal that really embeds the sandbox instrument into the text of a proposed regulation. This is going to be very interesting also because of the inherently experimental nature of AI developments and the ever-evolving opportunities and risks that AI comes with. One of the boxes that Lucy, I think, has not fully mentioned in the pyramid, but is important in my opinion, is the not mutually exclusive notes that you had there. Because I think there's a lot of playing around with those categories that we probably will do with the comments of our discussants and speakers today. And finally, one thing that is also important with respect to the debate as it had unfolded on the risk assessment, which is at some point also, as I was involved in the study on the impact assessment, there was a little bit of concern among stakeholders that this would lead to a sort of a massive, widespread, notified bodies-led conformity assessment, a set of procedures that everybody had to go look for a notified body. That notoriously there are not many of them that are available to perform checks on AI as well. And indeed, many of the assessments the conformity assessments that the Commission associates with the as obligation with the high risk application are internal checks, internal self-assessments, and this also will potentially pave the way for the development of standards, guidelines, methods, and evolving knowledge on how to perform those assessments in the best possible way. So there is something quite a lot for the market to develop as well. And this is a perfect bridge for me to my first discussant, my first friend in our lineup, which is Barry, because Barry not only has been the vice chair of the high-level expert group, professor of computer science at the University College Cork, but many hats in international academic groups on AI, very also engaged with the public debate on the global governance of AI, on the orientation of AI towards sustainable development. But among the 52 musketeers of the high-level expert group, he was also the one that took the lead on enabling us to develop a first embryonic version of an assessment list on trustworthy AI, which was then translated into a software which is publicly available and might, who knows, become a first input into many future versions of what these checks will be about. So Barry, I give you the floor, and I will introduce then the speakers one by one. I give you the floor. You're free to share your screen and show us your slides. And I thank you very much for being with us.
Great, thanks, Andrea. I wish you were introducing me more often, actually. So thank you for that very kind introduction. I actually don't. I'm not going to show slides because I think I really want to talk to the audience. So great thanks to CEPS and yourself and all of your colleagues for the invitation today. I really do appreciate it. I suppose the first thing I should say is huge congratulations to the Commission for getting this over the line. As the former vice chair of the high-level expert group, our mandate finished in 2020. We worked on some documents and with the Commission. I can only imagine the challenge and the long hours spent on this document. And one of the things that, as I read the document, I'm just conscious of is how rich it is. And I think it's going to take quite a while to work through the detail and to fully understand the consequences. And so I think one of the things I noticed this week is that there's a lot of commentary from both industrial people, from the industrial side, the academic side, the civil society side. And what's interesting is that there are as many positive remarks as there are reservations, and I think this is actually a very good sign. Actually, I think it's good that it suggests at least that the regulation has passed the first test of balance and fairness, in a sense that people see that this is a substantive piece of work, and so I think that's great. Obviously, the regulation is going to give and does give great clarity to not only the citizenry, but also the industrial world. It shows what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. It is really great to see that some of the work in the high-level expert group, we can still see it today in the regulation. And I think just on behalf of the HLEG, I think people would feel very proud of that fact that that the huge amount of work that went into the high-level expert group activity was taken very seriously and listened to. And I think it's of course we don't have the monopoly on what is appropriate for EU regulation, but I think it's great to see many of the aspects of what we recommended in terms of key requirements, in terms of a risk-based approach is what we see today, and the subtlety of the definitions and the considerations in the various chapters and articles, I think is hugely is to be welcomed enormously. I suppose the other thing we really need to do, and I think this is just a word to the community at large, this is a 108-page document that has been written by with great attention and consultation and expertise. And I think often when I've read documents of this complexity, I've often found that thought I had a very strong opinion about something, only to discover that I misunderstood some subtlety in the argument. So I think we all need to take great time in understanding what the document says. Obviously, there are challenges in a document like this. AI is a field that is not easy to define. It's not easy to define where the boundaries are. It's not easy to define what's in and what's out of AI. And I think we'll see lots of discussion about, well, does my rule-based system that I built 15 years ago, is that considered AI here? You know, is the fact I use this technique, which, you know, statisticians also use, is that AI? And I think we'll see a little bit of a shakeout here. I think as a consequence of the regulation, we're probably going to get a firmer view of really what's going on in terms of AI in Europe, because those companies who are describing themselves as AI companies and who may be not doing AI, I think there's now the incentive for them to sort of own up and sort of, you know, admit that, look, you know, the AI in here really isn't AI at all. Also, I think it is going to be a challenge for regulators to make sure that people are not abusing that definitional fuzziness. You know, that so that's going to be very, very interesting. I think the move away from the white paper 2-level risk categorization to this 4-level risk categorization is very, very interesting. And I think, Andrea, you were very right to call out this this box in the center, that sort of, as I think Commissioner Breton said at the press release, you know, he referred to, you know, things being a little bit of yellow and a little bit of orange, and I think you know, it gives great flexibility in understanding what the and expressing, I suppose, some of the issues. I think one of the things that is going to be interesting with a risk-based view is, and I think it was interesting in Lucy's slides, this idea that, you know, users need to use AI properly. We've seen lots of examples of AI systems that I suppose we would have perceived as being very low risk, but they turned out to be very, very high risk as a consequence of how they were used. A very good example of this is the YouTube recommender system. So YouTube turned off recommendations and commenting on videos related to young children, for example, quite some time ago. And that's because I suppose people with particular you know, interests in children were basically exploiting the operation of the recommender system to get access to additional content that might sort of satisfy their peculiar interests. And so, in a sense, there was a technology that, in a sense, is not high risk, but can be used in a way that is a high risk use. And so, I think there's going to be lots of challenges around observing when AI systems deservedly become high risk because they're used in a particular way, and as a consequence, there are all sorts of detrimental impacts and so on, and just the natural use of them shifts the categories. And I think it's very nice to see in the regulation that these will be that conformity and so on, and the risk categorization will be reviewed on an ongoing basis. So I think that's going to be very, very interesting. I think on the whole, I think you know, my view of the regulation is extremely positive. The subtlety of some of the issues here are going to be very, very challenging, and I think it's going to be interesting how, you know, as the regulation progresses, how these technical issues do come to play. And I think a lot of the things that we face will be around definition. I think, you know, is my technology, is my product covered here? In what way is it covered, and how should I regard it? I think it's very wise to establish this AI board. It's very wise to consider the establishment of an expert group, because I think some of the issues that will arise will need some discussion and some interpretation. And I think that's only natural in this context. And I think the fact that the authorities, the national authorities that are at play here, are the ones that, in a sense, we already have. So I think it's clear to me, at least, that there's great effort being placed on trying to reuse the machinery that we already have for regulating personal data, for example, and so on. So, which recognizes the fact that AI is not unregulated. This is not the first time that we see regulation that's relevant to AI. The GDPR is a classic example. So I think great congratulations to the Commission. I think they've done a really fantastic job. I hope that Lucy has a long, restful weekend. That's from what I'm sure has been a year of really, really incredible hard work and dealing with some really challenging issues. But I think this piece of legislation, this regulation, this leadership will reverberate right around the planet, regardless of whether companies are selling into or developing in Europe or not. I think it's tremendous, and I think it really sets out the stall of what Europe wants to be in terms of trustworthy AI. And I, for one, I welcome it strongly, and I really congratulate the Commission. So thank you.
Thanks, Barry. That is really a +1, as sometimes people say.
+1, yeah, +1, yeah.
That's super. So indeed, as time goes by and we don't have a lot of time for this seminar, I actually encourage the speakers, since we already are exploiting them and not sufficiently on a Friday afternoon, to also check a little bit the Q&A section that they have, because there are some questions piling up there that they might want to answer directly by typing. So I will immediately pass the floor to another colleague that has been a glorious member of the high-level expert group, an extremely good colleague in that context, Francesca, who is working with IBM, but at the same time an academic, a very prominent academic also in the context of the AAAI Association, and very well known also for being able to manage the technical aspects of AI together also with the regulatory and policy aspects. You demonstrated that, Francesca, regularly, constantly when we were working together on the ethics guidelines and also on the policy and investment recommendations. So the floor is yours. Let's see if it's going to be a +1 or a +0.5, or let's see let's see what Francesca tells us about this proposed regulation.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, and thanks, Lucy, for the very clear presentation of this very significant document. So it's definitely going to be a +1. So the impression is really very, very positive. Of course, these are just initial thoughts, because as Barry and everybody said, we need to go into the document much more to understand the fine details, but also to understand the implications of all these decisions that are being laid out there. So the first thing I have to say is that, of course, this risk-based approach, which was already outlined in the white paper, is definitely the way to go. So we have been discussing within IBM for a long time. We've been publishing about that, pushing for what we call precision regulation. So definitely we think that the risk-based approach is the only way to regulate AI. And when I say regulate AI, of course, this is not correct, because you don't want to regulate AI, which is exactly what is not done by the document, but you want to regulate the AI systems, the AI applications, the AI use cases. And this is really, very, very important difference. So in some sense, the definition of AI, that I will come a little bit later, is important, but it is not possible, as Barry mentioned, to define clear boundaries between what is AI and what is not AI. It intersects with many other disciplines, but it's important to understand the uses, whether these uses of this technology are high risk or not. So the second thing is that in the white paper, as Andrea mentioned, there were only two, or Barry, I think, there were only 2 levels of risks, and it was more like a definition of risk which was sector-based, which was a bit concerning, because, of course, every sector, like healthcare or other, may have high-risk applications of AI and non-high-risk applications of AI. So we really welcome the much more fine-grained definition of risk, with the 4 levels, with the long list of the applications that generate possible risks. So that's really a very, very significant step forward, and very, very important that the Commission decided to take this approach. Then the emphasis on trust and transparency. So trust, the emphasis on trust, which was also in the high-level expert group, we called it trustworthy AI. We decided to call it, the ethics guidance for trustworthy AI. So the realization that without trust, not just in the technology, but in the whole AI ecosystem, then we cannot get these beneficial effects of AI, what AI can really provide us in the positive side. So the building of trust, the focus on the building of trust is really very welcome, as well as the emphasis on transparency. Like at IBM, we use this idea of the AI fact sheet. At the high-level expert group, we had the self-assessment list, and then there are other mechanisms, but really the transparency obligation, which are also for lower risk AI systems, is very important, because, for example, you cannot sometimes detect and mitigate all possible biases in the AI system application, but you should definitely be transparent about what is there, what are the properties, the capabilities, the limitations of this AI system that you are delivering and using. And the next thing that is very welcome is the fact that the emphasis on the fact that there is an ecosystem. It's not just obligation on the providers, but also on users, and then in some other parts of the document, also on other stakeholders. So everybody should play his or her part in making the whole ecosystem trustworthy. So it's not just the providers that have to do their part in how they develop, how they design the AI system, the users, how to use it, but also everybody else. So that multi-stakeholder approach is really very important, and we really welcome that. Here again, the relationship with the fact. So I'm very happy that the work that we did together with Barry, Andrea, and many others was really useful to contribute to for helping the Commission to think and frame this new regulation proposal. So with our requirements that you can find here and there in the regulation proposal, some of them are merged, as Lucilla said, but they are all there. And with the ALTAI, the assessment list for trustworthy AI that we put together, and it's also available and has been used by organizations all over. Then also we welcome that some things are really unacceptable. The famous red lines that, as Andrea said, we didn't feel brave enough to put in the high-level expert group documents. But I think that even without red lines, that document also led to this regulation proposal with these red lines. And of course, these are consistent with what many, including IBM, has been saying. For example, you may have seen that our CEO sent a letter to US Congress already at the end of 2020 saying that we firmly oppose the use of technologies, including real-time remote biometric identification, for things that impact on fundamental rights or human rights or freedoms of people. And we don't release general purpose facial recognition tools, meaning that we want to have full knowledge of control of the uses. So the uses are really important to really assess whether it's high risk or not. We also welcome the mechanisms that the Commission has been putting together and designed, like the standards, the conformity assessment, the code of conduct, as well as the regulatory sandboxes. This is very important. Let me go to the last slide, which has some topics for discussion. So these are not negative points, but I think topics that will deserve some discussion. One is the definition of AI. Already Barry mentioned that is very broad, but on the other hand, nobody can give us a definition that, I bet that there is nobody in the world that can give a definition that has clear boundaries about what is AI and what is not AI. The second one is that there are some things that maybe need clarification, like sometimes is in the requirements for high-risk AI application, there is a mention of data sets that have to be free of errors. And in my view, it's not clear what these errors are or how they could be free of errors. Another one is about when the document talks about transparency, information to user, and it talks about operation that is sufficiently transparent to interpret the system output. That to me refers more to explainability than transparency. And so I wonder whether there is something that is already tackled by GDPR or it should be added here. So there is some discussion there. The other one is regarding market surveillance section that talks about the possibility to access the AI source code. First of all, it's not clear to me what the source code could be, because an AI model has data as a source code, and then that source code is trained with the data, is tested, and then you build the model. So what is the source code? Is that source code or is the model, and so on? So I think there needs to be some clarification. And then the last point that I want to point out is that it is in principle very reasonable that that long list of high risk application, given the AI board and the expert group, can be subject to modification, because you look around, you say, oh, this thing now, I didn't think about it, but now I see that it's high risk, I want to put in the list. But that can generate uncertainty on providers, on companies that try to enter into a market or not, and make some consideration. So I guess that there is the need to have some discussion about the implication of this agility in changing this list of in the pyramid of the high risk, of the lower risk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Francesca. Very good overview, and also some food for thought at the end. And indeed, I forgot to mention that you were also leading in the high-level expert group, the subgroup that actually attempted to give a definition. It was actually another very good experience, and another piece of responsibility that you took on your shoulders very well during the high-level expert group's experience. It's like the holy grail, right? And actually it's a constantly moving target, but certainly will be one of the central issues also in the debate that will follow. Now, there's someone that, what Francesca is offering food for thought. There's someone that would actually need this food for thought when understanding whether there are changes needed, and this is certainly Mia Petra, together with her colleagues in the Parliament, because they will need to analyze and study this regulatory proposal to decide whether the Parliament wants to amend it within the context of the ordinary legislative procedure. I'm sure Mia Petra will have a very important role in all this, because she is among the MEPs one that has a very solid technical background, a very good vocation towards policy making and also modernizing policy making. So we're very happy to have you here, Mia Petra. We're very curious to know what you think about this. You're also involved in this work of the AIDA committee in the Parliament that is trying to sort of coordinate a little bit the work from the different committees and political groups into relatively common positions whenever possible. So what's going to happen next? As you see it, we're curious to hear. So the floor is yours, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Andrea, and greetings from Helsinki. I came back from Brussels, and on quarantine I will have a lot of papers to read, so I will not be very precise and detailed, and I cannot on behalf of the Parliament, but on behalf of the Parliament, this was very much expected, waited for regulation, as when we talk about on the global level, when we talk about for the future of societies, we do want to have a say for the people, and it is actually the democratic right of the Parliament and Commission duty to have some guiding lines for the future. So it is not to let all this power in the hands of the authoritarian states, nor to the technological companies alone, because these all interlink with our futures, and these tools are needed. So the first question when I started to talk with the stakeholders after this was, is the balance right? Shall we get more innovations, or will we regulate so that innovations will not happen? All the parliamentarians will now have a calm head. A lot of lobbying will be there to say that this is almost impossible, or it is like saying too much or saying too little. But I also give A+, because it is actually a great piece with a good combination of the general principles, but also very concrete answer for the Europeans. And I guess when I saw some greetings who's following this here, that there are people in this planet waiting for someone setting the guidelines, where to go, how to go. And I'm very much happy that we can see also improvements from the leak version when it comes to the very concrete ways that when you're a child and your child is like not intended to be the target of the AI, but might be use them and get involved, and then at least we have some ideas of think about it. Engineers, everybody, coders, companies, so that have this kind of ethical thinking in the whole system. So this is what the regulation will bring along, even if not precisely stopped everywhere, that this gives impetus for the whole process, I hope. And then also for the working, I think we do see some applications that already passed the red line. What is a human centricity? What is the human dignity? Because the worker is should also be seen as a human dignity. So we are not part of the machinery, as we were not in when the industrialization started. There were a lot of rules, a lot of institutions created because of the industrial world, and now the new era of AI, some rules and scope where to go needs to be set. So for the balance, I think this is also important to remind that, as Lucia did in the end, this is one piece of legislation, but at the same time, we have the European Data Governance Act going on. Actually, I have been busy with the Monday deadline for the Data Governance Act. So to get more data available, have the rules how to have it. Then we do have also more money that we used to be. So the tone in Europe has been like a panic sometimes, that look how many AI companies do we have. But at the same time, congrats for the universities and academia. We have more papers than the US, but we have less than China. We invest more than China, but less than US. So I think we have all tools at hand to have this balance, that this will not stop innovations or use of AI in Europe. Already many panelists took the definition side, and of course that will be one part also that we will have to look for months, because sometimes when you don't regulate AI, but you regulate the cause, or you regulate the what actually will happen, that same might happen without help of AI. That might, was it someone said that it might happen with the help of the statistical calculation without any AI, but our own calculations to say. And then also that what is the scope of the AI? Is that moving so fast that that it will be out of scope already or bypass very soon? But this will not be a lobbying way to say that you should not do this. I'm very sure Europe will do this and will have it right. Those who argue quite quickly that it should be shorter, it's too much to read for the SMEs and companies. Actually, I'm not sure with the 20 years of legislative experience that will happen, because then you want to be more precise, give more clarity, and then you end up even more precise definition. And that normally takes some more articles or pages. So from the Parliament side, there will be tens, if not hundreds of MEPs working on it. We have had at least 12 initiatives in this less than 2 years that this Parliament has been together, and I very much have to be happy and say thanks for the Commission that it has taken this on board, because there were special questions for the face recognition or remote biometric identification, as it's now called. There has been questions for the risky association when it comes to the personal rights of the people, whether it's counting your social security or your recruitment and others, implications that has a clear impact on your rights as a citizen, as a person. So we will not legislate the whole world, but we'll legislate this part of the world and the applications used here or with our data. So this is where we want to see some cooperation and see that we can remain open, data flows and others, and the source code and all that needs to be looked at the way that we can see that it's trustworthy, the systems comply with our legislation. And I'm not at all unhappy if this kind of Brussels effect will then get more. And that was actually what both commissioners say. We are open for the international agreements, international minimum standards, and EU is very active in OECD and WTO, wherever we can find people to protect our citizens on the globe. And we will start with the Europeans. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mia Petra. And I think we're all curious to see how the Parliament will approach this. But I think, I don't know, I'm starting to reconsider these conferences, these events on the late Friday afternoon, because I think people become a little bit more in a better mood on Friday because they sense the weekend is coming. You're getting all +1s, Lucilla. But also you mentioned the international dimension, which leads me to move directly to Josh, our fourth speaker. And Josh and I and colleagues from Brookings and CEPS have been since last year organizing what originally was a transatlantic and then overall has become a global dialogue on artificial intelligence. And all the panelists here have been participating in those dialogues. I think it's been an extremely rewarding experience so far. We're coming up with a report soon also on the prospects for global AI cooperation. And obviously we'll need to take into account what has happened a couple of days ago, Josh. So I'm really curious to see whether the +1 is also coming from the other side of the Atlantic. Even Francesca is also there, but Josh really could tell us a little bit what he sees happening in terms of reaction in the US. So
thanks, Andrea, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to be here among so many colleagues, and I just want to echo everyone's congratulations to Lucilla and her team and the Commission broadly for the work and putting a marker in the sand in such a way on AI. I think it's a really important outcome here, and it's going to generate a lot of conversation and debate. We're at the very early stages of it, but it's really a very worthwhile contribution to this important endeavour. You know, we're not even at lunchtime here in the US, so I hope that doesn't sort of influence whether I'm a +1 or not. I still got an afternoon of work ahead of me, but I think it provides a really great foundation for cooperation internationally. I mean, look, at the end of the day, where we want to cooperate as much as possible within the realities of our politics, and the Commission has to take into account its priorities and its legal frameworks. The US will do the same. We build bridges in the process as much as we can, and I think this is a good foundation for building on, and opens up and keeps open many opportunities there. When I think about like the opportunities for cooperation on AI, particularly when I think about the US and the EU, a couple of sort of headline things come to mind for me, at least in terms of what do we want to achieve. I think one of them is, on the big picture of ethical AI, getting a common message out there that the US and the EU and other like-mindeds can essentially land on. And I think we've always been on strong footings there. We've aligned on the OECD AI principles. We work together in GPI, in the G20 and so forth. And I think this carries that further. We want to support innovation. I mean, I think it's absolutely in everyone's interest that the US is at the leading edge of AI, that the EU is at the leading edge of AI. And so getting that balance right between regulation as a driver of innovation, I think is absolutely crucial. And I think this, definitely heads in the right direction. In that regard, this is not heavy on innovation, this piece. Obviously, there are other sort of mechanisms underway and funding and so forth that matter more in that respect, but the regulatory sandbox piece and so forth, I think is welcome. And then I think the other bit is certainty to businesses, because that's where the AI, R&D and the innovation and where it's ultimately really happening. And, I think that's about certainty in terms of legal certainty. I think it's also about ensuring that our markets don't become too disaggregated, because we need access to each other's markets in order to scale and to be efficient and to really drive those innovative opportunities. And again, I think this is in a good place in terms of making that happen as well. So I'll just make a couple of high-level comments about where I see some of the similarities developing between the US and the EU. There's still a long way to go on this. I mean, this has obviously got very big extraterritorial effects. It's very similar to GDPR in that respect. I think it's got almost the same, penalties involved for non-compliance and so forth. So it's going to make everyone in the US, I think, initially take a deep breath, just because of that. But I think once they get into it, people relax a little bit more. You know, as Francesca said, the risk-based approach is crucial. I think the way it's now been articulated, it's very flexible. I like the 4 categories. I think they provide a lot of scope. There are boundary issues which we were always going to have to work through and which will be challenging. There's no escaping that. But I think that's a good place. The emphasis on risk and opportunity, I think, is also very important. I think calling out some areas of AI as just being unacceptable, particularly around, say, for instance, social credit scoring, which is a clear shot across the bow to what China is doing, I think is essentially very important as well. And again, I think aligns with getting a clear message out there on some of those issues. There's this, you know, I think there's a real attempt in the regulation to align as much as possible with existing international principles regulation. I think the flexibility and compliance, again, I think the point that Francesca made about the opportunities for self-assessment are really a crucial element here. And this is actually quite a complex bit, because giving companies the opportunity to develop the procedures to actually assess compliance and so forth will be very important. So in terms of developing the management and process standards that can then be carried into the international standard setting bodies, which will also be important for developing global approaches for certifying AI. So there's a lot of sort of developments, I think, which will flow from allowing companies that flexibility, which will also provide a really important sort of foundation for building better approaches and coordinated approaches in some of the global standard setting bodies as well. So I think that's going to be a useful sort of feedback mechanism as that develops. You know, there is always a question, I think, around the impact of some of this on small and medium-sized enterprises. And I know the European Commission is alive to this. There's obviously an article on it in the regulation, but it's really quite a small little article tucked away there. It's obviously backed up by what you were talking about, Lucilla, in terms of there's funding and a lot of this will happen at the member state level. But I do remain concerned about the complexity of some of this for small businesses and what that might mean. And so it just simply means that we really need to pay a lot of attention to that, because there's always the risks that we lock in a lot of incumbent first mover advantages with these types of regulations, which is obviously not the intention here. And making sure that we maintain a really vibrant, innovative environment for startups is absolutely going to be crucial. Let me just quickly provide a couple of high-level observations about what's going on in the US at the moment, because you know, while the US is not going to come out with anything like this, there's a lot happening on the ground, which I think maps quite nicely onto where you've ended up on the AI regulation. And a couple of points I want to make here. The National AI&D Strategic Plan, there was one in 2016, another one came out in 2019. You know, there's a lot of actually sort of, you know, coherence there with the AI regulation. If you look at the for instance, a lot of emphasis on essentially getting to incorporate ethics by design, and how do you actually do that? And I think that will flow naturally from the approach to this AI regulation, where essentially there will be a lot of emphasis on the developers of the AI to ensure that it is essentially ethical by design. And so I think those two areas, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make that happen, but I think that maps together quite well. The OMB guidance from late last year, there are differences in emphasis around how do you balance risk and opportunity, but I think, you know, they map quite closely, and I think that's a good thing. Again, the whole area of national standards and what the NIST process is doing here in the US and the industry-led process, I think will be supported by the emphasis in the AI regulation on businesses self-regulating and ensuring they comply. So I think that's another positive development as well. And I just actually want to flag something that came out this week, which I think is actually potentially significant in the US, which is the FTC announcement that they may actually apply some of their regulatory authorities under you know, Section 5 and so forth, to actually ensure that when you say that your algorithms are unbiased or non-discriminatory, that in fact, if you're not, you may actually be breaching, you know, requirements for fairness and so forth. And there's huge fines. The FTC's leveraged, over 6 billion in fines in the US for breaches of privacy. So actually, when they get involved, they've got enormous enforcement power. So this is a new development in the US, but it's potentially a very significant one in terms of actually bringing enforcement power to bear in the short term on some of these ethical AI issues as well. Again, I think that maps on very nicely to where the EU is heading in addition. So let me leave it at that and say congratulations again.
Thanks a lot, Josh. So this sounds very, very promising, and I think Lucy has probably reassured by some of these comments. But I think we are witnessing here a case of good procedure. I think, because this is something that it's not been improvised. I mean, this is something that the Commission has organized with lots of inputs and lots of discussion and lots of also changing the original approach. I mean, I've been involved very much in the drafting of the text. I mean, not myself, but I mean, in observing the text as it was evolving over time. And for example, the high risk, low risk stayed in the Commission's proposal for quite a long time. And then the public consultation, the experts, the academics were still voicing, including some of the ones that are present here, the need to be a little bit more nuanced, the needs to give more space to understanding the differences in risk and the types of risk also generated by different types of applications, depending on the context and so on and so forth. Now, we have 12 minutes before we wrap up. We have 23 questions, okay. And we have a number of questions. So rather than giving the floor to Lucy for feedback on the 4 interventions, what I'd say, I'd rather maybe put together some of these questions before I give the opportunity to Lucy to wrap up and to give us her final thoughts. We have a one question that was asked very early on since while the FTC has a very encouraging blog post, what happens with the EDPS with its blog post being a little bit disappointed that there's no moratorium on RBI systems, remote biometric identification systems. There's a couple of clarification questions, and that we'll see probably hundreds of them in the coming weeks on the broad definition of AI that is given. But also, for example, Jean Dessin is asking whether if the AI is applied as a support to internal teams, so something like an internal decision-making support system, is it still defined as high risk, or is it only when it's, for example, consumer-facing or citizen-facing that it should be defined as high risk, and whether this applies also to techniques that perhaps are a little less, let's say, cutting edge or frontier, but a little bit more legacy techniques that perhaps have different features, or perhaps, according to some, less risky features, as, for example, more modern, for example, machine learning techniques. We have a number of questions on manipulation as well, and that is also one thing that I would add to the discussion, meaning the prohibited uses and the manipulation. How, probably only the future board and expert group will have the possibility of clarifying where does the boundary lie between nudging people, which is happening everywhere with the use of AI systems, or hyper nudging, as our colleague Karen Young would put it, and subliminal manipulation. So, and just many of these questions where many commentators actually say, what do I do now? I mean, how do I apply this? And for example, some questions on micro-targeting, a question on how long do records have to be kept. Our friend Vince Conitzer was asking a question on what is the degree of automated processing. So these are all questions about thresholds, meaning where do we start calling it AI, or where do we start calling it high-risk AI? How do we apply this in practice? These are all questions that are more, rather than on the overall foundation and approach to the regulation, are more related to the how do we operationalize concretely these provisions, which I think is a discussion that is very healthy, and we will have it going forward. There's a question on sandboxes, and how do we ensure that national entities have sufficient capacity to facilitate research, and would it be beneficial for large companies to set up startups to ensure priority access to sandbox testing? Yeah, although probably this is not for the Commission to decide, meaning large corporations are always free to do this. Nicolas Moyes is asking if you can say something else about the expert group, whether there's something on the expected sectorial composition. I think Lucy's answering this question already live. And there's Marta is asking a question on the medical devices. How will the conformity assessment be done by the notified bodies, and whether this will require additional guidance, and how more generally, I think the issue of how to establish those links with the existing sectoral regulation. The medical devices regulation has been extremely useful also as a benchmark, I think, in the crafting of this legislation. And then Lucy, there's a question really directly to you from Luis Barreto on how to achieve an effective and comprehensive regulation without hindering innovation. So the magic formula, especially looking at the competitive position of European companies. It's a little bit the Brussels effect, if you wish, also that Mia Petra was echoing before. I will probably stop there. Sorry if I cannot pick all the questions in detail. Lucy has actually asked for the list, so if you have anything that we can do to enable answers to these questions after the meeting, we will do this. But I will ask perhaps Lucy to help us wrap up with all that you have heard, and perhaps with some final thoughts. If the other panelists have additional thoughts in like max 30 seconds, I might ask them also to prepare something at the end and to flag this if they want to intervene. Lucy, over to you, and then you will go for your weekend.
Not yet, but thank you very much. Still have a meeting. Thank you very much, and thank you for all these questions. And indeed, I asked Andrea to collect them because it's very, some of these questions are very, very good, and I need to I want to reflect on some of them. The definition, effectively, like Francesca said, it is broad. It is the one of the OECD, as I said at the beginning, and it includes both machine learning and expert systems. So it is not, many people think the real problems come from machine learning, but we kept it also for the expert systems. But I think, like Francesca says, putting a very strong boundary is very difficult. I totally agree with what she says in terms of not possible to be free of errors. I'll go and check where that thing went in. And when I talk about the source code, we talk about the source code, the real source code as you defined it. I think in terms of the uncertainty because of the changes in the list of use cases, the idea of the proposal we have, if we will see how it will be accepted in the interinstitutional discussion, is to have a change of that list through delegated acts, which is faster than through normal legislative procedure. But it can only be in the areas that we identify in the text of the legislation. So the areas that I showed before, the use cases are in an annex, and that annex can be changed. Of course, I think that it will take always time and discussions to change the annex, and so I don't think it will be like a surprise for the developers. Does this hinder innovation? Really, I hope not, because we really made a big effort in trying to focus to high risk as much as possible, and also to define the use cases so that we're not in a situation where the developer is asking himself or herself, is this risky or not? It's not making a risk assessment. It's really either I'm in the list or I'm not. And so this, I hope, increases legal certainty, which in turn should increase development and use in turn will increase development as well. So we don't see the trade-off here. We really hope we really took that very much into account. In terms of, somebody asked about the internal use. Well, the fact is, it depends on whether the application is in the list of use cases. There are use cases that are internal use, for example, the employment applications. Yeah, some of these applications are between employers and employees, and we don't want artificial intelligence basically to exacerbate this difference in bargaining power that already exists. So we have put some safeguards there, and that is, let's say, an internal use of an application probably. So it's not only for consumers, it can be internal, but it has to be in the list of use cases. There was a question on the automotive sector. Okay, so this is a bit of a complex explanation that I have to give now, in the sense that this regulation would apply directly to the safety product legislation. This is for the experts, under the new legislative framework. So that means machinery directive, toys directive, medical device regulation, radio equipment directive. These are all called new legislative framework. And then we have old legislation, safety legislation, including automotive. And these are pieces of legislation that really include all the rules in themselves. And this act can apply to this kind of regulation only when this kind of regulation is actually revised. But all this old legislation, automotive, I think there is something for aviation, they are revised quite frequently. So by the time we have the whole discussion, interinstitutional discussion and stuff, I'm sure there will be for revision, and so it will apply there as well. On the assessment, there was a question on the medical devices. How would that change the conformity assessment for medical devices? Well, not to a big degree. We made a big effort in reusing existing organizations and processes. So the idea is a medical device goes to a third-party conformity assessment. It has to undertake certain checks. Among those checks, there will be checks on artificial intelligence, which are not there at the moment. Although software is included in the medical device regulation, we do not check the AI. So they would simply add these checks to a process which already exists. The same goes for robots or for any product that we are already assessing for safety. And this is also giving very much, opening up very much to the emergence of standards, because in European legislation, when you have harmonized standards, you don't need necessarily to go to the third-party conformity assessments. You can just declare that you comply with the standards, and therefore you will be considered as such, and it will be a self-assessment. So we hope also that with this regulation, we give rise to the publication of standards that decline how the 5 key requirements can actually be applied. And I hope that those standards are international. So I link to the international comments that have been made. I think there is a lot of scope for cooperation in international standardization. And I also want to highlight the fact that we are putting in place a level playing field. So the rules apply whether you're European, American, Chinese, doesn't matter where you're from, the rules apply to those who introduce these goods and services in the European market. We don't make a difference, you will see, between the large companies and the small companies, because we are talking about high risk applications, and we think that even if they're developed by small companies, we're sorry, but it's high risk for the citizens, for the users, for the businesses, and so they have to be checked. The impact on SMEs, we've been very careful with that. We think that on the basis of the assessments we made, that this impact is reasonable, and I saw very good reports actually even from the SME Alliance in the European Union, and I appreciated that very much, because it means that we managed to be limited in terms of burden on enterprises. And then a very last comment on the fact that we look forward to discussing with the European Parliament. There are many different views in the Parliament. It's very good to hear these comments, and the destiny of this regulation is to be either considered not to go too far enough, or to be stifling innovation. We know that, but we look forward really to having all these conversations with the European Parliament, with the member states, and this is what's going to happen in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. This concludes our meeting today. I want to thank Rosanna, who's been helping me. Not only she's one of the co-authors of the study that we did in support of this proposal. So Rosanna, maybe you should switch on your video so that people see you. I want to thank all the panelists, and you did a great job. I want to thank all the attendees as well. If you go through the list of attendees, you will see that there are many potential keynote speakers in any AI event at the global level that are following us, hidden in between the crowd, some former colleagues in the high-level expert group as well. So all the greetings to all the friends that are connected, and also the others that we don't know. We thank you very much for having been with us. This starts a new, let's say, wave of discussion on a proposal that is now on the table. Certainly not the last time when we sit down and discuss those issues, but I think it was a great start, and we thank the Commission for having provided us with a lot of food for thought for this. So Mia Petra, Josh, Barry, Francesca, and Lucy,
thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's been a great pleasure to have you with us, and we all wish you a fantastic weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend,
Thank you,
everyone.
Andrea.